all of the first generation Starlink satellites have been launched and global coverage is about to be turned on. What does that mean for RVers and cruisers, and when will the Starlink beta end? Hi, I'm Chris with the Mobile Internet Resource Center, here to give you a big update on the state of Starlink. Now, as we're recording this video here in early July 2021, we are kind of in the lull between generations of Starlink. SpaceX has finished launching all of the 1,500 plus satellites in the first shell, the first basically phase of its constellation. Those satellites have all been launched. They're working their way into their final orbits, and SpaceX has said that they will be ready and the shell will be complete and fully in service sometime in August. That will be what gives SpaceX global coverage. Sort of global. We'll get to that in a second. Meanwhile, we're kind of like in this pause. They haven't had any launches as they're gearing up for the next phase of their satellites. Their version 1.5 is what they're calling it of the satellites, in a different polar orbit, and they're going to start launching those probably later this month, and to start, basically getting to the next step in Starlink. So this is a really good time to pause, take stock of what's up with Starlink, where's it going, where's it been, and what does this all mean for those of us who want to use it nomadically. So first off, a very quick recap for those of you who have been living under a rock as to just what is Starlink. Well, Starlink is SpaceX's massive satellite constellation to bring fast, unlimited, really low latency, broadband internet from space to the entire globe. It is a ridiculously ambitious undertaking, unlike anything that has ever been attempted before. And even here in just the early days of basically the first part of the first phase of Starlink, SpaceX already has more active satellites in orbit under its control than, basically all the rest of the satellites up there combined. It's a big project, and they are still only just getting started. The better than nothing beta is what it has been called, has been going on for since the end of last year and has been expanding outward and outward. But it is still early in the beta phase, and they've been signing up customers. They just announced they've had set a record with 69,420 customers connected to the network at once. So Starlink beta is rolling out to more and more places, and people are discovering the joys of having potentially as much as 300 megabits per second speed, decently fast uploads, super low latency on a satellite connection that works, well, works at your registered home address. So there's a lot of excitement about Starlink. People are legitimately thrilled that this, it kind of, for people who have had limited connectivity or have been frustrated with their providers, Starlink is an entirely new ballgame. It is super exciting. It is legitimately revolutionary. And of course, even though SpaceX is focusing on rural, residential, underserved people, a lot of RVers, a lot of cruisers who have struggled with connectivity are dreaming that Starlink is going to be the answer to their needs as well. No more struggling with weak cell signal, no more dead zones, no more any of this. Wow, internet that just works anywhere, super fast. Just give Elon Musk all your money. Well, it's not quite that simple. Starlink is not a panacea. It doesn't solve all connectivity problems. It is also still early in its development and has a long way to go. So that's kind of the long recap of just what Starlink is. Now, where is it right now? So the first shell of Starlink that they finished launching is 1,500 satellites. The first shell is giving SpaceX coverage between 57 degrees north latitude and 57 degrees south latitude, because all these 1,500 satellites are kind of in a sine wave pattern. And that shell is carefully calculated so that wherever you are in those latitudes, once those satellites are fully deployed, there will always be at least one Starlink satellite passing overhead, hopefully more than one. But the shell being complete means Starlink can claim global coverage, asterisk, except for the poles, double asterisk. Well, these first generation Starlink satellites, the 1.0 satellites, require a ground station to be connected. So if you are here you have to be able to be within range of a Starlink satellite overhead, and that Starlink satellite then has to be in range of a ground station to bounce your signal back down to. If you're out to sea, or if you're out in countries or overland or places where SpaceX has not built ground stations, doesn't matter, no global coverage. And well, of course, SpaceX also still needs to have licenses and roll out the business in each of these countries. So they're going to be able to say in August, there is a satellite passing overhead wherever you go, assuming you're not at the poles, for Starlink, but it is going to be limited to the countries that they have operating agreements in and being in range of ground stations. Now, for most of us, most of our audience is in North America, North American nomads, and SpaceX has got that covered. They have a whole lot of ground stations built out in the United States, and once the satellites are in final positions in August, they'll be able to flip a switch, and that's probably when they're going to expand their beta from where it's currently stopped at 33.6 latitude and northward, and they'll be able to start rolling out Starlink service to everyone, or every area in North America. But then, oh great, does this mean we finally can get Starlink in the south and other places and stuff? Well, there's still another catch. Just because the satellites are overhead, there's still capacity as a concern. So that is the next phase of what SpaceX needs to build, is they have to put more satellites up there so that they have enough to serve the audience that they're out trying to cover. And this is the important thing where a lot of people get confused, is they think SpaceX is out to replace their cable companies and replace their cellular companies and be the be-all, end-all for connectivity. And the first person who will tell you otherwise is Elon Musk himself, who has been very, very clear that no, Starlink is not for everyone. In fact, they're only targeting 3%, maybe 5% of the population, because if you're in an area that has an urban area or an area with good cellular infrastructure, an area with fiber optics running through the streets, Starlink is not going to make sense. There will be better options for getting connected over shorter distances than relying on satellite. In the underserved areas who are out in more remote places, Starlink is indeed a game changer. And for the people who are thinking, well, I hate my cell company, I hate my cable company, I just want to be done with them, you actually might not even be able to get Starlink service. If you're in a congested area, SpaceX has been clear that they're not going to have enough capacity, and they're going to be limiting capacity, and even some of the 500,000 people who have pre-ordered might not eventually get service, or might not get service until late 2022 or beyond, because there's just no capacity for some of these areas where there's just too many people interested in Starlink and not enough satellites that will be overhead anytime soon. So that's kind of the state of Starlink. It's not for everyone. And now let's tell you about what's coming next. So that first shell is out there. It is going to be flipped on. It'll be all the satellites in position in August, and then SpaceX is going to start launching the next shell of satellites. And these satellites, about 300 plus of them, are going to be in polar orbits. So instead of going sine wave up and down across the planet, they'll be going over the poles, and that is what will give SpaceX full global coverage. And while you're thinking, well, this is going to be awkward places to build ground stations, is up in the poles and down in Antarctica, all that other, out to the oceans. No, actually, these are the first satellites that SpaceX will be using their long plan for vision to have laser interconnects between the satellites. So these version 1.5 satellites will actually have lasers that will talk from satellite to satellite to satellite. So if you're here, going overland or sailing across the ocean, you don't have to worry about being in range of a ground station. As long as one of these polar satellites is overhead, it'll relay the signal through space and down to a ground station somewhere else. So once these 1.5 version satellites in polar orbit are deployed, SpaceX is saying it'll take about another 6 months once they start launching them. That will actually be true global coverage. They'll be able to finally offer service to cruisers and out to Alaska. And potentially all sorts of other interesting things. So that is what's coming next. That might be starting to actually be ready for customers sometime in early 2022. And even still, SpaceX is still just getting started. They've got a much bigger network plan. They've got licenses from the FCC for well over 4,000 satellites that are in their phase 1 constellation, and they'll be starting to launch additional shells into that will just bring more capacity. So you'll have more satellites overhead, more chances for them to be able to serve more customers in more areas. They'll be rolling those out. All of the satellites that they launch into that next phase, that will be the 2.0 satellites, and they will have the laser interlinks. It will be faster, better, all sorts of interesting next generation stuff. That's coming in 2022. Beyond that, over the next several years, they actually even have another generation of what they call the Phase 2 network, 7,000 satellites that will be going into that. And then they've even already applied for a 30,000 satellite constellation to really fill the skies and add a ton of capacity in the multiple years ahead. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming with Starlink, but it is not here yet. So don't get too ahead of yourself. Don't think this is going to be your be-all, end-all connectivity solution anytime soon. Certainly not in 2021. And still, even in 2022, they're just going to be getting started with these future upgrades. So Starlink is better than nothing beta. Will potentially end sometime this summer when the first shell is completed and they expand service to everywhere. But it is still early days, and it is still going to have limitations. So a lot of people who are been in the beta are reporting kind of mixed results. Some of the people who are getting their first taste of fast connections ever are thinking Starlink is the best thing since sliced bread. They're super excited by the experience. The speeds are great, and they don't really mind a little bit of downtime here and there, and there's been quite a bit of those little bits of downtime. A lot of other people, particularly people who are trying to work online, are very frustrated with the state of the Starlink beta. Having a 5-second drop every 5 minutes might not matter if you're web surfing or streaming, but if you're conducting meetings over Zoom or VPN'd into a corporate account doing work, that actually could be really frustrating. So those people are finding, well, Starlink is their fast and unreliable resource, and then they are using connection bonding or falling back to cellular, or still using cellular as their primary and Starlink just for entertainment and stuff like that. So that is not going to be magically undone. They've still, SpaceX knows they still have a lot of work to do. Starlink will be getting better over time, but it is always going to have some challenges there. Specifically for RVers and cruisers and others who want to, be mobile with Starlink, well, we're ahead of the curve. SpaceX is not ready for mobile customers just yet. At first, the systems were very unfriendly to mobile customers because your Starlink service is assigned to a single cell, a single service address, and you cannot take that and use that very far outside of your cell and get connected. The network, even if there is Starlink coverage, will ignore you. Back in April, SpaceX made it easier that you can manually, without having to go through customer support, change your service address. So you can just go online, make a few clicks, and you can just point at the map and say, I want to be connected here. And in a matter of 5 to 10 minutes, your service will shut down at your first service address and go to that new location. But the big catch that a lot of the nomads who are trying to start using Starlink on the road have discovered is there's not Starlink service to turn on in a lot of places. A lot of places SpaceX hasn't turned on the cells, hasn't activated them yet. The satellites aren't listening. So big parts of the country, it's kind of, don't know where or when because there's no coverage map provided, but they'll discover, oh, this address works. That next address they're going to with their RV, doesn't work. And, well, then the next address after that, they try to change their address to it, and Starlink, SpaceX says, sorry, that area is at capacity. You cannot be connected. And it becomes kind of a little bit of a hit or miss game. And some people are being successful with this, taking Starlink on the road and report maybe they're able to get connected in about 50%, some people more, some people less of the places they travel to. Particularly a lot of the popular areas are at capacity, where RVers congregate for the summer. A lot of them, the first people to get there, turn on their Starlinks, are connected. The late arrivals, SpaceX is saying, nope, no service for you. I know. And the dish just will not connect. You can play some games and, try and pick an address that may be 20, 30 miles from where you're actually at. And You'll get spillover coverage from the other cell if it does allow you to get there into the congested cell. You might not have as great of speed or performance because you're not officially at your right address. But there are games you can play, but still, Starlink immobility isn't quite working yet because of this cell system. Now, SpaceX has said, and they've applied with the FCC, to start doing mobile versions of Starlink that will get rid of all this manual address changes and being assigned to a specific cell, and will actually let you take Starlink mobile, and will actually even allow Starlink to work not just being portable, set it up in new locations, but take it and use it in motion, which is what you really need on a boat, because a boat is almost always in motion. At anchor and even at dock, there's quite a bit of motion. So mobile Starlink is coming, but not yet. It's still in the FCC licensing phase. It's still in the hardware development phase. Maybe later in 2021, maybe next year. But the key is nobody knows outside of SpaceX if there will be new hardware required, which is very likely, or new data plans and service plans also, which is potentially likely. So don't count on buying the $499 Starlink now and being able to use this with future easy mobile service. You're getting ahead of yourself. You're probably, if that's what you really want, better off waiting, whether it's another 6 months or another year before mobile Starlink is ready. Speaking of, future Starlink dishes, we've got some news on the Dishy system. The Dishy McFlatface is the Starlink receiver that SpaceX has been selling. They've been selling it for $499. It's kind of pricey by some standards, but it's actually originally was costing them about $3,000 to build, and they were very proud and excited to announce that the cost is now just a bit over $1,000. They've done a lot of work to cost reduce Dishy, but, well, it's not really necessarily the best business logic to be selling a $1,000 satellite dish for $499. So recently Elon Musk spoke at the Mobile World Congress, talked about how bringing those costs down is pretty much their biggest challenge with SpaceX and Starlink, and they're hoping over time and into the future to be able to get the price down to the price that they can sell it without having to subsidize it to maybe $300, maybe even $250. And to that end, SpaceX has just filed with the FCC and is asking for permission to sell a second generation of the Dishy McFlatface that is supposed to have roughly equivalent performance, but is a lot cheaper to manufacture, and it may be potentially a little bit smaller. So that is coming, and it is potentially an interesting shift. We've also discovered that over the course of the last few months, SpaceX has shifted from selling a Dishy with a black leg to a Dishy with a gray leg, and even though SpaceX says the only difference is the cosmetic color of the leg of the dish, the stand that it's on, several people in the RVing community have been testing these two Starlinks side by side and have discovered that the gray leg Dishy uses about 30% less power than the original black leg Dishy. And well, that brings up to another one of the major concerns for people who want to take Starlink on the road is it is a power hog, particularly if you're trying to run it off of solar. The original blackleg Dishy would typically be using sometimes well over 100 watts of power continuously, and if you're trying to stay connected 24/7, that is a lot of solar, a lot of battery capacity, a lot of energy needed. The gray-legged one is better, but is still, likely using more power in your RV than a residential fridge is. It is still a major power draw. So hopefully these future updates, the cost-reduced next-generation production Dishy, will actually be a more power miserly as well. But Starlink will never be able to compete with cellular for being low power, just because a big dish beaming data to and from space just has a lot more electronics in it and needs a lot more power. So that is another catch that a lot of nomads haven't really thought through, is the power needs. And we've also talked about, well, Dishy for people who are in smaller RVs, it's kind of big. Its storage needs are a challenge as well. But the biggest challenge that a lot of people aren't really considering is, well, Starlink hates trees. Starlink, when it's connected, the satellites are moving through the sky. So it's not like traditional satellite systems where you can aim between the trees and you're pointing at a geostationary satellite, and as long as you can get a little spot of sky, you can stay connected. The Starlink satellites are moving across the sky, and you're being passed from one satellite to the next every 2 minutes or so. So as the satellite goes across the northern sky from you, if you've got tree, 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 that's a drop, that's a drop, that's a drop, that's a drop. And that is a problem. And now SpaceX has pushed out some new software that makes it easier for the Dishy to automatically and just electronically in a matter of milliseconds switch to a backup satellite if your primary one goes behind an obstruction. So you'll stay connected if there happens to be another Dishy somewhere in the cone of the satellite above. But that is still a problem, and for a lot of travelers who want to take Dishy into the woods and stay connected, that is going to be a challenge, particularly if you're doing things that are sensitive to drops. So streaming, where there's a chance for the network to buffer, surfing, where you don't mind if there might be a second or two pause while there's a temporary disconnect behind the scenes. No big deal. Some people are using Starlink in a decent amount of woods, as long as the canopy is not too heavy over them. They're staying connected, but Zoom calls, don't. VPN connections, nope. Some of the interactive stuff, video chats, just are going to be a problem using Starlink in the forest, and that's always going to be an issue. Another issue, going through the things that nomads are discovering with Starlink, is currently you cannot take, a lot of people have the dream of, I want to take Starlink and go down to Baja, or I want to take my Starlink system and roam through Canada, and once the borders are open, I just want to travel and stay connected. Well, fortunately, the borders are closed, so not too many people have run into this yet, but Starlink right now is being operated independently in every country. So Starlink USA and Starlink Canada are operating completely separate from each other. Starlink Mexico, which is going to be ramping up in the near future, is also going to be a separate entity. And SpaceX has not put in any provisions for roaming or transferring hardware between one entity and the next. So if you buy a Starlink in the United States, it will not work in Canada. If you buy a Starlink in Canada, it will not work in the United States. Hopefully, likely that will be addressed at some point, but right now SpaceX is selling every Starlink they can build as fast as they can build them. So making roaming easier and addressing the needs of us snowbirds and RVers and travelers who want to hop country to country might be a low priority for them. So if that is your big plan, don't plan on it just yet. We actually already know some people who are planning to buy 2 Starlinks if they have to, just so that they can go country to country, but probably better off just waiting. And then there's another Starlink issue that has actually been in the news a lot lately this summer, is the first generation Dishy system actually will shut down if the internal temperature reaches 123 degrees Fahrenheit. Through the winter, nobody noticed that, but here in the heat waves that have been happening this summer, in some places, particularly if your Dishy is out on asphalt that reflects heat up into it underneath, people are discovering that during the heat of the day, their Dishy just shuts down. So that is another concern that hopefully will be addressed in the second or future generations of the Dishy hardware, but right now is something else. Is another thing that's why they call it beta, and it is one of the concerns that early adopters are running into. So yet more reason to potentially wait on Starlink. Now, just a quick little recap of the Starlink isn't the only massive constellation that is underway. So just as we're covering the state of the satellite industry right now, summer 2021, there are other competitors out there. We've been watching all the progress OneWeb has been making. This was another big constellation that is under construction. They went bankrupt, came out of bankruptcy, got actually funded by the UK government and under the Queen, and now have a lot of money and are back to launching and building their constellation. They are starting with polar coverage and actually are aiming to have service in Alaska and the northern latitudes potentially before SpaceX does. But in strong contrast to SpaceX, OneWeb is not planning to sell directly to the consumers. They're going to be working with partners who will be then offering their service in various fashions. So we expect to see actually OneWeb doing some interesting things in the marine market through partners and in regional places like up in Alaska in particular. So keep an eye on OneWeb. They are actively launching. The other one that is got some big potential is Amazon's Project Kuiper, which is a huge, another gigantic Starlink-sized constellation that would seem like it was big pie in the sky if it wasn't Jeff Bezos and Amazon committing billions and billions of dollars to building this. So they basically have infinitely deep pockets to put Alexa into orbit and give beaming down everywhere. And at some point, Kuiper will actually reveal some details and start launching satellites. Right now, they're just kind of in the pre-phase. They've showed off their antenna design, and they've just contracted for their first 9 launches that will hopefully start happening maybe next year. So keep your eye on Kuiper. And then, well, Viasat is basically the leader in geostationary satellites, the old school satellites, the ones that are just sitting high in the sky, beaming down, broadband from 24,000 miles up above the equator. Viasat is on the verge of launching their 3rd generation, their Viasat 3 satellites, starting next year. And they are going to be the highest capacity single satellites ever put into orbit. These things are going to be having a massive amount of bandwidth, and will be able to do interesting things with a lot of potential speed to service all across the hemisphere. But the catch is the speed of light means that Viasat, no matter how much bandwidth they put in geostationary orbit, will always be at a latency disadvantage to the swarms of low Earth orbit satellites. And, well, to avoid from becoming a dinosaur, Viasat is actually now trying to use the courts to force SpaceX to stop launching Starlink, to go into a long environmental review process. They're actually trying to undo the federal subsidies that SpaceX has got, and basically do everything they can to slow down SpaceX and Starlink until they have a chance to try and find a way to be relevant again. So that's kind of a big update. There's a lot going on in the Starlink world. The SpaceX is making a tremendous progress. It's really, really exciting to watch. We literally watch every launch. We cover every little bit of news. There's a lot of cool things going on. But again, we just have to reiterate, there's so many people who think that Starlink is going to be their solution. They're waiting for their address to be turned on. They've got their pre-order, and they're waiting for their Starlink to come. And we are hearing from a lot of people who get their pre-orders and finally get a Starlink shipped to them, and they are disappointed because it doesn't work in the places they want to travel to. It's bigger and more awkward than they thought. It works great for streaming, but not for their Zoom calls and stuff like that. So a lot of people are getting ahead of the curve and being disappointed. So we encourage people who don't want to be on the bleeding edge and who don't want to be beta testers to just keep waiting for Starlink, and to instead keep planning, because even once Starlink is solid and reliable and available where you want it to work, it is still going to be at best a complement to cellular. You'll still want cellular in your connectivity arsenal as well as Starlink, and you want to find ways for them to work together, whether that is using a router that can take both as inputs, maybe bond them together using connection bonding, or load balancing or failover and stuff like that. So start planning for that now. Plan maybe sometime next year you might want to add Starlink to your connectivity arsenal. But keep in mind, how are you still going to keep a cellular connection? How are you still going to tap into other ways online for the places that Starlink might not meet all of your needs? There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. Watching the space race is absolutely fascinating. We covered all at the Mobile Internet Resource Center. You can track it at mobileinternetinfo.com/satellite. We keep updated articles on all of these things and are tracking the news, particularly from the standpoint of travelers, RVers, cruisers, nomads, and people who want to stay connected, not in a fixed location, but on the go. If you do like long, in-depth coverage like this, a special shout out to our Mobile Internet Aficionado members, our MIAs. are who fund our site. We are not advertising supported. We are not affiliate driven. We are a membership site, and they are the ones who allow us to focus on diving deep and researching into all of these topics. How long was that? 3 hours?
These videos are brought to you by our premium members, our mobile internet aficionados. They make it possible for us to track this news and create these videos. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, or better yet, consider becoming a member yourself.